The story of St Mark's Church is one of faith and devotion of a small rural community. This was taken from the St Mark's Ermington Centenary 1883 to 1983 booklet. Nothing has changed. This church still has a rural feel about it, but it's now in a suburban setting. Hi, my name is Linda Calder, and I'm a new member of the congregation at St Mark's Anglican Church in Ermington. In 2021, we held an Easter festival, and I volunteered to give a tour and talk on the history of the church. It's a fascinating walk through the history of the local area, with significant links to local and famous pioneers. St Mark's Anglican Church Ermington was established on its current site in 1881 to serve the local community of Ermington and Riderley, which was known at the time as Dundas. There's a small sandstone chapel, church building, rectory, toilet block, and hall, and its site is situated between the larger and older churches of St John's Cathedral, Parramatta, which was established in 1792, and St Anne's Ryde, established in 1826. The size of the congregation has waxed and waned over the last 140 years, and the church is seeking to undergo a revitalisation as the population grows, and a major development is planned in the local area. In the late 1700s, the land on which the church property sits was once known as the Field of Mars. But wait, I hear you say, the Field of Mars is some distance away. The Field of Mars Cemetery and Reserve is over near North Ryde. It's not down there on the northern bank of the Parramatta River. Well, that's the case now in 2021, but it wasn't always so. First, we need to understand how land was granted back in the early days of the Sydney colony. Free settlers and ex-convicts who were of good conduct and disposition to industry were entitled to a land grant. Each male was entitled to 30 acres, an additional 20 acres if married, and 10 acres for each child with him in the settlement at the time of the grant. Women were also entitled to land grants. From the 20th of August 1789, non-commissioned marine officers were entitled to receive 130 acres, and marine privates were entitled to receive 80 acres. At this time, commissioned officers were excluded from land grants, but in 1792, the acting governor, Francis Grose, made land grants to marine officers. Therefore, in 1792, 8 marine officers were given Crown grants along the northern bank of the Parramatta River. Mars, being the Roman god of war, the area became known as the Field of Mars. So Alexander MacDonald, James Manning, John Carver, Thomas Swinnerton, Thomas Tynan or Tyning, Thomas Cottrell, Isaac Archer, and John Coltrane all received grants. There were also grants to John Seymour, William Reed, and Philip Schaffer, and Isaac Tarr. However, not every marine officer was suited to farming, and by the beginning of the 1800s, 2 of these grants had been abandoned, those owned by Cottrell and Tynan around what is now known as Ermington Bay. This is the Reverend Samuel Marsden. He arrived in New South Wales as a free settler on the 2nd of March 1794 on the convict ship William with his wife Elizabeth and his first child Anne, who was born on the way. Marsden was born in Yorkshire, England in 1765, but he died in New South Wales in 1838. He'd been unwell and went to convalesce at the residence of his friend, Reverend Henry Stiles, at St Matthew's Church at Windsor. While there, he succumbed to an incipient chill and was buried in the family tomb in the cemetery near his church in Parramatta, St John's Anglican, where he was the first rector. St John's Anglican Church is in the plaza near the Parramatta Town Hall. Anyway, in 1803, Samuel Marsden purchased and consolidated the Tynan and Cottrell grants. In fact, he purchased quite a lot of parcels of land, not just in Ermington, but further afield in Sydney, such as in the Marsden Park area in 1815, the South Creek, County of Cumberland parcel. Like many new colonists, Marsden had to take on many roles: gardener, farmer, magistrate, minister, and grazier. And he was a significant contributor to sheep farming, probably second only to John and Elizabeth MacArthur. Back to Ermington. Samuel Marsden not only purchased the Cottrell and Tynan estates, he also purchased the land north of Kissing Point Road that had belonged to Captain Campbell and George Barrington. The consolidated land here in Ermington was 335 acres, and it spanned between the current Atkins and wharf roads and extended from the Parramatta River up to Stewart Street. The entire land block was known as Kingston Farm. Passing through Marsden's new 335-acre plot was the Driftway, allowing stone from the Dundas Valley Quarry to travel to the Dundas Wharf on the Parramatta River at the end of Dundas Road, or what is now Spurway and Broadoak Street, and you can still see its remains today. The Dundas Quarry, or Pennant Hills Quarry as it was known at the time, is now a playing field and park in Dundas Valley called Sir Thomas Mitchell Reserve. It was actually an exposed volcanic neck or plug. The bluestone or basalt quarried here was carried down the driftway to the wharf and loaded onto boats to travel down the Parramatta River to the city, where it was used to build the roads of Sydney. The quarry was in use until the late 1940s and was of such geological significance it was visited over its life by a number of famous scientists, among them Charles Darwin and Douglas Mawson. Let's pause to have a look at Samuel Marsden's family tree. Samuel and Elizabeth Marsden had 8 children, of which only 6 survived. Their oldest child, Anne, was born during their trip to Australia. Anne married Thomas Hassell, who was the first to set up a Sunday school in Australia and the first Australian-born put up for ordination. Following his training in Wales, he was curate to Samuel Marsden at St John's in Parramatta. Then he was chaplain in Port Macquarie, Bathurst and cow pastures when that parish included Goulburn and Mulgoa. He was known as the Galloping Parson because he had such a large parish to cover. Samuel Marsden left property to Anne for the entirety of her life. Upon her death, it was to go to her younger sister Jane, but Jane predeceased her by a few months. Marsden and his wife had 2 sons who lived less than 4 years. Their second daughter, Elizabeth Mary, married Henry Bobart, another minister. He arrived in Australia with his first wife, Frances. While Bobart was in New Zealand working for the Church Missionary Society, Frances died from consumption or tuberculosis, which was only 9 weeks after arriving in Australia. Bobart returned to Sydney, was curate to Samuel Marsden, and then married his daughter Elizabeth before becoming the pastor of St John's in Parramatta himself. Elizabeth inherited the Cottrell land grant portion of Marsden's estate in Ermington. This is the portion adjacent to current-day Wharf Road. Marsden's only surviving son was Charles Simeon Marsden. Father's death, he inherited the properties in the St Mary's area, the South Creek property that is now called Marsden Park. He married Elizabeth Brabham, but unfortunately was a man of expensive tastes and unrealistic expectations. In November 1842, he was declared bankrupt and lost his property to creditors. It appears that Charles was never discharged from his bankruptcy and died intestate, spending his declining years on a small estate of 180 acres, known as Shrivenham, originally part of his own property, which had been bought back by his mother-in-law. Marsden's next daughter, Mary, married John Betts. John Betts became a pastoral pioneer, having come out to the colony as a tutor to a gentleman's family settled in North Parramatta. The couple had 7 sons and 3 daughters and moved to land in the Bathurst district called Molong Station, situated just west of Orange. It was 16,000 acres granted to his wife as a marriage gift. However, Mary also owned a portion of the Kingston Farm estate, the small section that was north of Kissing Point Road in the southwest corner. However, this portion of land was sold off. It's an important piece of land for St Mark's Ermington, and I shall come back to it. Marsden's 5th surviving child and 4th daughter was Jane Catherine Marsden. Jane inherited the Cottrell land grant. This land is going to be very important for the Church of St Mark's. Jane married her father's second cousin, Thomas Marsden, so her surname did not change. Thomas was a storekeeper at Windsor before moving to Sydney. Marsden's youngest child, Martha Marsden, married Josiah Betts, the brother of John Betts, her sister Mary's husband. It was their son, Edward Marsden Betts, who would buy back his aunt's portion of land in the southwest corner north of Kissing Point Road. So just to recap, Jane Catherine Marsden took possession of a southern part of the land below Kissing Point Road on the western side, the original grant given to Marine Thomas Tynan, or Tyning. Her sister Elizabeth owned the land to the west of this, adjacent to Wharf Road. This will be important for St Mark's, Ermington also. Because on Elizabeth's parcel of land, south of modern-day Victoria Road, then called Kissing Point Road, and against Wharf Road, there were two lots, 8 and 10. These passed through the hands of Anne Smith to John Edwards. Edwards rented a long building on lot 10 to St Anne's Church in Ryde. Remember, that church was established in 1826 and subsequently consecrated in 1870. This long building was St Anne's Chapel of Ease. But what is a Chapel of Ease? Think back to the late 1800s. There wasn't much choice for getting around, horse, cart or foot. To travel the 3.6 kilometres from the Ermington area up to St Anne's in Ryde by foot would take about 45 minutes. Owning a horse, or even better, a horse and cart, would be expensive. So a Chapel of Ease allowed locals to meet, pray and hear from the word of God more easily. Then the only person who needed to travel by cart was the minister, who travelled down from St Anne's to run the services. In the Chapel of Ease building, the congregation that would become St Mark's, Ermington, started their Sunday school on Sunday the 15th of February 1880 and had their first Anglican service there the week after on the 22nd of February. Let's go back to Jane Marsden for a moment. Her son, also named Samuel, was also a minister. In fact, he became the first Bishop of Bathurst. He had always hoped to build a church on the highest point of the land owned by his mother. Let's just pause here for a moment, because as an aside, the current Bishop of Bathurst is Mark Calder. He's no relation. He is another local boy, though, who attended both Eastwood Public School and Epping Boys High School. It is funny because while he's no relation, he's always confused with another local boy, my brother-in-law, Stephen Calder, who also attended Eastwood Public School. Stephen was also a minister, and the two Calders served in neighbouring churches on Sydney's North Shore in the early years of their ministry. And just recapping about that northern section of land that had belonged to Mary Batts, née Marsden. Remember, this had been sold and it passed through many hands, but eventually came back to Samuel Marsden's grandson and Mary's nephew, Edward Marsden Betts, son of Josiah and Martha Betts, née Marsden. So, to fulfil the younger Reverend Samuel Marsden's vision, Jane offered a portion of her land holding to the Bishop of Sydney to build a church. This is the current site of St Mark's, Ermington. Edward Marsden Betts also offered a small triangular piece of his land adjacent to his aunt's in order to give the church property a frontage on Kissing Point Road. Without it, there would be no road access to the church property. The future members of St Mark's, Ermington were meeting at the Chapel of Ease. After a service at the Chapel of Ease on Wednesday, the 18th of August, 1880, the congregation unanimously determined to accept the land kindly and generously given by Mrs. J.C. Marsden and E.M. Betts, Esquire, and they decided to build a Protestant church upon that land. A building fund committee was formed, as you do when there's something to build in a church community. The members of this committee included church wardens and notable members of the church community, some of whom have familiar local names. Mr. Richard Cowell Sr., Cowell's Lane. Mr. John Vines, Vine Street. Mr. Henry Selby, Mr. John Edwards, who owned the land where the Chapel of Ease was meeting. Mr. Richard Hughes, Hughes Avenue. Mr. William H. Smith, who had a long-standing association with the church, and Mr. James Stevens, Stephen Street. In fact, if you investigate the memorials on the side windows in the St Mark's Ermington Chapel building, you'll note two of these surnames. These windows were donated by James and Martha Stevens, memorialising members of their family. Who were James and Martha Stevens, though? Let's look at Martha Stevens' née Capon. I will explain why the windows are in the names of both Cowell and Stevens and why this is one family. Aged 16 years, Martha Capon first married William Cowell in St John's, Parramatta, with the original Reverend Samuel Marsden as the minister. Cowell was transported as a convict to Australia on the convict ship Atlas in 1816. He'd attacked and robbed his employer. William and Martha had 2 children, William Cowell Jr. and Richard Cowell Sr. It was this Richard Cowell who was on the Building Fund Committee for St Mark's, Ermington. Unfortunately, Martha was only married for approximately 2 years before 36-year-old William died. So, at age 23, Martha married again, this time James Stevens. They were also married in St John's, Parramatta, and the presiding minister was again the Reverend Samuel Marsden. James was also a transported convict sentenced for forging. He arrived in Sydney in 1821 aboard the Hindostan, which was later called the HMS Buffalo. Martha's first daughter by James Stevens was Mary. She married William Spurway. William lived on the junction of Kissing Point Road and Stewart Street, which is the area of the current Lottie Stewart Hospital. This was land formerly owned by his father, who had bought it from the Brush Farm Estate. The Brush Farm Estate itself was originally owned by Gregory Blaxland, the Blue Mountains explorer. William Spurway's parents, George Sr. and Frances Pratt, were both transported to Sydney as convicts, both of them for stealing. George Sr. arrived aboard the Claudine in 1829, and Frances arrived aboard the Lucy Davidson in the same year. They both worked on the Brush Farm Estate. Frances received her grant of leave in 1832 and George 6 years later, when he then established his own prize-winning farm on the Lottie Stewart house area. They were married in 1835 in St Anne's Ride. Following Frances' death, though, in 1857, George married Anne Hughes in 1859. Take note of that surname because it's going to be important in a minute. William Spurway's youngest brother, we'll call him George the Younger, built and owned the Heritage House Riverview at the top of Marsden Road. This is the old cottage with stables that still sits on the corner of Marsden Road, opposite the old bowling club and Morriston House, kind of hidden behind some bushes. Another of William Spurway's younger brothers, James Spurway, married Maria Ann Smith, and she is the daughter of the famous Granny Smith. The graves of at least 4 Spurways are in the St Paul's Carlingford Cemetery, which is on Marsden Road behind the nursery. George Spurway the Jr. and his second wife, Anne Hughes, 2 of their infant daughters, Eliza and Selena, and also George Sr.'s daughter, Eliza Spurway, and her husband, Thomas Hassel Hughes, who was Anne Hughes's brother, and Eliza and Thomas's 11-year-old son, Ernest Alfred Hughes. Cowell, Spurway, Hughes, all the families are linked. So let's go back to the Church of St Mark's in Ermington. The funds were raised, and the St Mark's Ermington Church was designed in the colonial Gothic style, a very popular style of building from the 1840s to 1880s with particular parts. This one was to include a high-pitched roof and buttresses, those piers that support the building wall, although in this case they're more decorative than structural, I'd say. There are other familiar buildings in this style that show other parts of that style. One is the Conservatorium of Music, which served as the stable to the current New South Wales Government House, which has the colonial Gothic features of turrets, the small towers, pinnacles, those high-pointed structural items on top of buttresses, and parapets, the low protective walls. St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney, while it's built in Gothic revival style, demonstrates colonial Gothic spires, tall, slender pointed structures on top of roofs. So the cornerstone of St Mark's Ermington Church Chapel was laid on Sunday, the 17th of December, 1881, by Jane Emma Terry, née Peters. Jane was married to Richard Rouse Terry, the grandson of the wealthy ex-convict Samuel Terry, who was a convicted convict transported to Sydney on the Earl Cornwallis in 1801, but later became quite a famous and wealthy settler in the city area. actually selling part of his land for the building of the GPO in Martin Place. Samuel Terry also has links to Samuel Marsden. When he was a convict, he worked under the direction of Samuel Marsden in a stonemasons gang, which cut stone for Parramatta Jail, the female factory, and St John's Church in Parramatta. When Samuel Terry died in 1838, he was so rich he had the grandest funeral the colony had ever seen. Jane and Richard Terry bought and rebuilt Denniston House in 1872, after it was destroyed in a bushfire in 1855. They lived there until Richard's death in 1898. This was very soon after his brother, Edward Terry, was elected the first mayor of Ryde. Terry is another familiar surname because there's Terry Road in Eastwood. Denniston House is now situated within Ryde Hospital, and it underwent major renovation in 2020-2021. Denniston House has served as a convalescent home, and once it was incorporated into Ryde Hospital, it became the maternity ward for many years. And many of the congregants at St Mark's were born there. In fact, the steep hill that leads up the southern side of Ryde Hospital is named after Jane's daughter, Florence. In 1882, not long after the completion of St Mark's, Ermington, it was joined with St Paul's, Carlingford, and they became the parish of Pennant Hills. Yes, Pennant Hills is a long way away. The current suburb of Pennant Hills is quite some distance away, but considering in those times there weren't many people around, it probably didn't have a large population. Also, St Paul's, Carlingford was a small sandstone chapel on Marsden Road. The building's still there and was used as a bookstore. Their cemetery is down the grass laneway beside Swain's Nursery. I've already mentioned it, and you'll find many familiar local surnames there: Cowell, Spurway and Hughes, also Stevens, Mobbs, Vines, Turner, and many more. No doubt many of the pioneers linked with St Mark's, Ermington were buried here during the time St Paul's and St Mark's were connected. The cemetery is no longer in use, but it's a fantastic local historical site and definitely worth a visit. Well, by 1900, the St Mark's church building was considered too small, and it was decided to enlarge the church and add a chancel and vestry to increase the seating in the church by 50. On the 16th of July, 1904, Mr. Edward Betts laid the foundation stone for the extension to the original St Mark's Ermington Church, and the chancel and vestry was added on the eastern end of the building. From the outside, you can very clearly see the change in brick types between the original building and the chancel/vestry section. This new section gave the church an opportunity for new stained glass windows. The side window was donated by the Sunday school and depicts Jesus, who is indignant and wanted to allow the little children to come to him. I have to say this is a particularly favourite story of mine, as I've had a passion for teaching the gospel to children. In fact, it was an important part of the ministry of St Mark's, Ermington as well, as we will soon see. The Sunday school at St Mark's was to become huge. And the main memorial window at the very end of the church, at the front of the church, as you would say, depicts Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. It holds many classical features, such as Jesus seated in the teaching position, a diversity of listeners, and two of the apostles with the ubiquitous halos. The top of the windows depict a castle structure, indicating the kingdom of heaven, and the cherubim in the circular window is holding the kingly crown, indicating that Jesus is the King of Kings. You can read the story of the Sermon on the Mount in the Bible in the book of Matthew, chapter 5, from verses 1 to 7. This window is dedicated to Jane Darvell. Jane was a regular congregant, and her association with St Mark's seems to have begun in 1888. In 1890, she donated new hymn books, and on the 17th of April, 1894, at the vestry meeting, at the AGM, she donated £5 to the church. This amount is about the order of $800 in today's money. But who was Jane Darvell? Well, she was certainly a local celebrity. Jane Darvell's husband was Major Edward Darvell, who had fought at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 with the Duke of Wellington. The Darvells lived in Denniston House before the Terrys. They leased it from 1840 to 1849 before it burnt down in 1855 and was rebuilt by the Terrys. In 1855, Edward Darvell purchased 400 acres of land between the present-day Shaftesbury Road, Victoria Road, Rydal Road and Rowe Street, all the land from Victoria Road, West Ryde, up to Rowe Street in Eastwood. Inside this property, he built Rydal House. Modern-day Darvell Park is within this area, as is Anthony Road, named after Jane and Edward's son. There are also many other streets named after connections with the Darvell family in this area. Major Edward Darvell built Rydal House in the late 1850s, and then he surrounded it with an orange orchard. He left this house to Jane upon his death, which she later gifted to her son Anthony William Darvell shortly before her death in 1899. Rydal House then became the rectory for St Columb's Anglican Church in West Ryde on Dixon Avenue. In the top photo, you can just see the entrance to St Columb West Ryde's old church building, the old church building that just appeared in the bottom corner. However, in 1976, they wanted to build a new church, so Rydal House was moved brick by brick to the Patterson Valley near the Hunter to make way for the modern St Columb's Church building. Well, Jane became a much-loved benefactor in the district. She sold land to the Commissioner of Railways in 1885, so the railway could go through her land. She sold land to the Crown in 1889 for Eastwood Public School and to the West Ryde Masonic Temple in 1898. Jane Darvell's son Anthony in 1904 proposed an auction of a portion of this land. Of note, Duntroon Street in this picture is now known as Rutledge Street, and the road passes over a bridge over the railway. And Blackstone Road in this picture is now known as Rowe Street, and it's actually cut by the railway, not a level crossing. Notice also at 1904, Eastwood Hotel is already there. Eastwood Public School now takes up the majority of the block, including lots 14 to 19, and the area covered by lots 40 to 45 were donated to the Anglican Church in 1906 in order to build St Philip's Eastwood Anglican Church, which opened there in 1907. St Philip's Eastwood Anglican Church is going to be very important for St Mark's as well. The church has now been extended, but this is original size. With the development of Eastwood then, in 1919, St Mark's Ermington was transferred into the district of St Philip's Anglican Church, Eastwood, and in 1926, though, ceded to the St Columb's West Ryde. Yet at the turn of the century, the St Mark's Ermington congregation only had a church building. They had no space for non-church related activities on that block. What to do? Well, they hired the Dundas Town Hall, which is up on Marsden Road, and it's still there, opposite the former Brush Park Bowling Club and Brush Farm Park. Here they held tea meetings, concerts and bazaars. The first bazaar was held in 1904, and in 1913 funds were put aside from the bazaars to pay for the building of a hall on the St Mark's Ermington Church site. So by 1928 there must have been sufficient funds, but they decided rather than build a new building from scratch, they would use the funds to purchase a well-built second-hand structure. It was a rusticated mahogany fibro cement building with excellent wooden floors. Subsequently, this school hall was removed from its original site and re-erected on the church grounds with an agreement that it would be enlarged as funds permitted. And so it was. In 1930, they extended the school hall lengthwise, and in 1932, they added a kindergarten room to the south side. In the 1930s, Ermington and Rydalmere were mostly farmland and open fields. This 1930s aerial photo shows the intersection of modern-day Victoria Road and Kissing Point Road. St Mark's Anglican Church and School can be seen with a familiar forked driveway towards the middle. Rydalmere is visible in the distance where all the trees are. and the current Ermington shops are at the bend in the road. This is a close-up of the church property. And the buildings, the house next door and the house across the road, are still there. Ermington really was very empty, so a small church was perfectly functional for the needs of the community. This photo looks west along modern-day Victoria Road. The bend is where the Ermington shops are now, and Rydalmere is in the distance. One of the congregants tells us stories of playing in the mud in the Ermington shop area and playing games there. This 1930s aerial photo looks east along Victoria Road and shows just how built up Rydalmere already was. It looks back to the mostly empty Ermington area. The bend in the road, again, being where the current Ermington shops are. And St Mary's Catholic Church was already built there in Rydalmere. Within this circle is also the Rydalmere Town Hall, a location that would become important for the new Rydalmere Anglican community. Well, following World War II, the area grew extensively. Because in 1941, during St Mark's 58th anniversary celebrations, it was reported that the Sunday school was making headway and had an enrolment of 24 scholars. It was also reported that on the extreme western edge of the St Mark's and Columns parish, several new homes were nearing completion and more were planned. This was the Ermington area. Indeed, the New South Wales Housing Commission undertook an extensive building program through Ermington and Rydalmere. And by the Easter service in 1950, there were 45 parishioners and 150 pupils in the Sunday school at St Mark's. St Mark's had a small school hall with a small extension with a kindergarten room. This was their meeting place. But they needed a larger hall. So in 1951, a veranda annex, affectionately christened the Deanery, was added to the school hall. It was called the Deanery because a warden at the time, Mr. P.A. Dean, enclosed the annex with windows. His wife Elise helped him by holding the frames while he fixed them in place. This is now a photo of the modern day property, just to give you a sense of what a part of the building was added. Let's now transition to Rydalmere and the growth in population there that was going to impact St Mark's quite considerably. In 1943, the previously empty fields were already being laid out. Familiar street locations and shapes of the suburb are present. Being World War II, you can see the naval stores down by the Parramatta River. This is where some of the Hollywood fleet were birthed. It was ships in the Hollywood fleet that were actually responsible for sinking the Japanese midget subs that invaded Sydney Harbour in 1942. In 1946, St Luke's Rydalmere was operating as a Sunday school in the Rydalmere Town Hall, near where the current Rydalmere Post Office is. And then by 1955, the previously empty fields were filled with houses. Those World War II naval storage sheds are still there in the background on the northern bank of the Parramatta River. Rydalmere Public School, which was built in 1891 in a long brick building, can be seen. This building, though, was a later addition, but that building is still standing today. And in 1955, the new St Luke's Church, built by volunteer labour, opened on the south side of Victoria Road on the corner of current-day Alma Street, where 415 Victoria Road now stands. A closer look at the previous photo shows both Rydalmere Primary School and you can see the actual St Luke's Church building. Count the number of windows down the side of the church. For those who know what I'm talking about, they will see. A modern-day Google Earth view shows the Rydalmere Public School is still there. But what has happened to the St Luke's building? As I mentioned, the explosion of population in the Ermington and Rydalmere area happened after World War II, and the early residents of the new Ermington and Rydalmere were ostensibly returned servicemen for World War II. There were 2 flags that were dedicated and placed in the new consecrated St Luke's Rydalmere Church. The flags were to commemorate the returned servicemen's participation in the Second World War. After what will come soon, these flags were moved and hung at the back of St. Mark's Church for many years, but they've been taken down and put in the glass cabinet now because they're very fragile and they can be seen. They've been replaced with new flags. Notably, the flags are placed either side of the Bible verse from John 15:17. Jesus said, "Love one another." It's an important reminder to ex-servicemen and all of us that peace comes from love. And since we're doing this in chronological order, let's just pop back to St. Mark's for a moment. A requirement of becoming an independent parish is to have a rectory where the minister can live. So in 1956, another building fund was established, and later that year, the church purchased 690 Victoria Road from Mrs. Richard for £5,750. This house is still there and still looks the same from the front, although it's a little hidden now from busy Victoria Road by bushes and trees. 690 Victoria Road, the property extended along the back boundary of the existing church property. So at the same time the church purchased this new rectory, they also purchased a portion of land at the back of 688 Victoria Road. This enlarged the church property to its current size. Thus, they now had enough room to build a future rectory on the site, which they did in 1967. The on-site rectory underwent a major refurbishment and internal restructure in 2021, which was significantly disrupted during the New South Wales COVID-19 lockdown in June to August of 2021. Now let's just think back to the end of World War II and the sudden growth in not just the Ermington area, but also the number of parishioners at St. Mark's. The Sunday school also flourished. So in March 1960, St. Mark's, Ermington and St. Luke's Rydalmere together became their own provisional district. And by this time, due to the growth in the area, mostly from the settling of returned servicemen, Sunday school numbers in both parishes were up around 400 students, with about 200 regularly attending each week. There was not enough room for all these students. In April 1961, the St. Mark's School Hall was opened up on the inside, removing all the walls to make one large space. And they made another addition to the southwest corner, but it was still not enough room for all the Sunday school students. So why the picture of the trams here? Well, 1861 to 1961, Sydney did have a tram system. And what do you do with a tram when it's exceeded its lifespan? In the 1950s, to provide temporary relief and more rooms for Sunday school classes, the State Transport Department donated 2 trams to St. Mark's, Ermington. They were trams numbered 1827 and 1791. They were initially placed behind the current church building, but moved in the 1960s to make way for the building of the on-site rectory in 1967. They were used until 1974. In 1981, a report went to the local fire brigade. There's a tram on fire. Well, the firefighters were convinced the call was a hoax because they knew there were no trams in Ermington. So they ambled along with no sense of urgency. But they were wrong. There were trams in Ermington, and they were at St. Mark's, and they had been set alight by a disgruntled group of local lads. The trams were finally demolished and removed in 1982. Let's just pop back to St. Luke's Church in Rydalmere. So outgrown its building. However, on its site, on the south side of Victoria Road, there was no room to expand. Reverend Mullins was a retired clergyman who'd been helping at St. Luke's since 1946, and he was instrumental in the building of the original church. He lived across the road, and his old cottage was being used as a Sunday school for the kindergarten room. In 1962, with Reverend Mullins' help, the land across the road from the St. Luke's church building was attained, and in the January of that year, they picked up the St. Luke's church building and moved it across the road to where 460 and 462 Victoria Road now stand, This is next to the walkway between Pine Street and Victoria Road. It was the peak of population growth and church life was rich, and it included a Sunday school, youth fellowship, SEBS, or the Church of England Boys Society, GFS, or Girl Friendly Society, ladies' fellowships, SEMS, Church of England Men's Society, choir, soccer matches, and even a cricket club. And things continued at both sites for over a decade. But in 1972 at St Mark's, Ermington, a veranda was added to the church building. If you look at this photo, the steps that lead up to the door have been modified now with the addition of a ramp to allow accessibility for elderly and disabled parishioners. But as they did this extension, they discovered that the St Mark's Church building had never been consecrated, so that was remedied. The addition of the St Mark's veranda also meant that the old cracked church bell that had called the faithful to church since 1911 had to be removed. The bell was recast and is now hanging in an old church in Hill End. There are two churches in Hill End with a lovely church bell, so it's either St Andrew's Anglican or perhaps St Paul's Presbyterian. Maybe you could find out and let us know. So by 1972, it was decided that St Mark's and St Luke's would benefit from amalgamating onto one site. The plan was to sell and demolish the St Luke's Church building in Rydalmere, sell the land and pay for a new building on the Ermington site. But after some investigation, a clever engineer at St Mark's determined that if the St Luke's building had been moved once across the road, perhaps it could be moved again down the road, which it was. The last service was held in the St Luke's building on the Rydalmere site on the 17th of February 1974. Parishioners expected to turn up for another service on the 24th of February, only to find the church already in its new location. This was all outlined in a newspaper article in the Parramatta Advertiser on the 7th of March 1974, entitled "The Church with Itchy Feet." You might like to pause this video now to read the newspaper article. So imagine, if you will, it's 6:20 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Normally, people are preparing to go to church, but at this time, 3 city-bound lanes of Victoria Road are completely blocked by a 10-wheel ex-Army US truck holding a church on its way to a new location. As it progressed down the road, the overhanging power lines were a hazard, but there was a clever solution. In this next photo, notice the pole over the top of the roof that's being pulled down at the front. This hooks underneath the power lines, lifts them, and ensures that the power lines slide over the top of the building and don't get caught on the front. The church took up all 3 lanes, all the way to the intersection of Victoria Road and Kissing Point Road. This is the photo from the newspaper article. And then the building had to come around the small corner and up the incline at the service station. This service station is actually still there, although it's not an Ampol station, but Ampol brand has made a recent return to Australia. The St Luke's Church building arrived at the Kissing Point Road site 1 hour and 45 minutes later at 8:05 a.m, just in time for the St Mark's parishioners turning up for their morning service. So the newly relocated building has since been linked with the school hall, extended with a porch and kitchen, and reclothed in brick cladding. The land on Victoria Road was sold in 1975 to pay for the move. All the buildings on the St Mark's Anglican Church site were complete, except for maybe the toilet block, which is a bit of an addition as well. But there is still so much more room to grow, which is fortunate. With the amalgamation onto one site and the building of an on-site rectory in 1967. In 1974, St Mark's Anglican Church Ermington was finally granted their own parish status. The church celebrated its centenary in 1983 and 125 years of faithful service in 2008. Unfortunately, congregation numbers have dwindled at St Mark's. And so on the 1st of January 2021, St Mark's amalgamated once more with St Philip's Anglican Church Eastwood at an exciting time for both churches. St Philip's has embarked on its own building program due to the growth in the area, and St Mark's is looking to revitalise and revamp its property and congregations. Could this union be seen as a homecoming, the Darville's two beloved churches coming together again as one? Also, like it or not, with the impending development in Melrose Park on the land once owned by the entrepreneur Samuel Marsden, new entrepreneurs will bring a vast population into our area. St Mark's Anglican Church, Ermington, is well situated to welcome these new residents. It's a small church now, but maybe the explosion in population similar to that 75 years ago in the late 1940s and 1950s may change that. The plan is to start a 10 a.m. family service to complement the existing 8:30 a.m. traditional service, and many more activities are planned. You are welcome to come and join us and check out a church that has deep connections to the history of the area and early pioneers of the colony, or, as some might say, Australian royalty. The story of St Mark's Church is one of faith and devotion of a small rural community, and the story of the people continues on into the 21st century.